Stop pretending, Emily. You're such a drama queen, Linda Carter said as the older woman slowly slid down into the wooden chair beside the long fellowship table. Around them, the Sunday luncheon at St. Mark's Church in Columbus, Ohio continued with the gentle clatter of plates and the soft murmur of conversations about grandchildren, weather forecasts, and the upcoming church picnic. 25 people sat within earshot that afternoon, though at first only a few noticed that something was wrong. Emily Carter, 68 years old, and once known throughout the neighborhood as the calm, reliable high school English teacher who never raised her voice, had been standing just moments earlier, holding a glass of iced tea. Her hand had trembled slightly. Then the glass slipped. The ice clinked sharply as it tipped onto the tablecloth, and Emily's shoulders sagged as if the strength had quietly drained from her body. For a brief second, she seemed confused, blinking slowly beneath the fluorescent lights of the church hall. Anyone who had known her for years could see the change in her face, the pale color, the faint tightening around her eyes. But Linda only folded her arms and sighed loudly. She does this all the time, Linda said to the people seated nearby, her tone half amused, half irritated. Anytime she wants attention. David Carter, Emily's 47-year-old son, shifted uncomfortably beside his wife. He glanced down at his mother, who was gripping the edge of the table as if trying to steady herself. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the quiet instinct that children sometimes feel when they see their parents vulnerable. But Linda leaned closer to him and spoke again before he could move. "David, come on," she whispered, though her voice carried farther than she realized. "She's fine. She just likes making scenes." Across the table, Mrs. Turner, a retired nurse who had attended St. Mark's for nearly 30 years, paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. She studied Emily carefully. The older woman wasn't speaking. She wasn't looking around the room the way someone might if they were seeking attention. Instead, Emily seemed to be breathing slowly, deliberately, as if each breath required quiet concentration. The room smelled faintly of roasted chicken, green beans, and warm dinner rolls, the familiar comfort of a Sunday gathering. Yet beneath that ordinary warmth, a strange tension began to spread through the hall like an unnoticed change in weather. Emily Carter had spent the last 3 years living quietly after the passing of her husband, Robert. Robert had been the steady center of their family for 42 years, a civil engineer who loved fishing trips and Sunday football games. When he passed away from a sudden illness, Emily had tried to maintain the small traditions they had built together. Morning coffee on the porch, handwritten birthday cards to relatives, weekly calls to former students who still kept in touch. She never asked for much from anyone. But over time, something subtle had shifted within her family. Linda Carter had entered their lives 15 years earlier, bringing with her a confident smile and a firm sense of how things should be done. At first, Emily had welcomed her warmly, proud to see her son building a life of his own. Yet gradually, conversations began to change. Linda would interrupt Emily's stories. She would roll her eyes when Emily mentioned feeling tired or unwell. The word dramatic began appearing more often in her sentences, always said with a light laugh that made others unsure whether it was meant as a joke. And now, in the middle of the church luncheon, that word hung in the air again. Emily lowered her head slightly as another wave of dizziness passed through her. The wooden floor beneath her shoes seemed to tilt just a little. She didn't cry out. She didn't ask for help. For decades, she had taught her students that dignity often lived in quiet moments rather than loud ones. But several people had begun to notice that her hands were trembling. Someone at the far end of the table whispered softly. Mrs. Turner stood up from her chair. "Emily," she said gently, stepping closer. "Are you feeling all right?" Linda let out another short laugh. "Please," she said, brushing a crumb from the table. "If you give her attention, she'll keep going." Yet by then, 25 people had stopped eating. 25 people had turned their heads toward the same quiet scene. And before the afternoon was over, every one of them would hear the truth that no one in that room had expected. Mrs. Turner moved closer and gently placed her hand on Emily Carter's shoulder while the quiet tension in the church hall continued to spread across the room. Emily was still seated, her fingers lightly gripping the edge of the table as if she was trying to remain steady. Her breathing was slow and careful, and although she had not spoken a single word, the change in her appearance was becoming harder to ignore. The cheerful noise that usually filled the Sunday luncheon had softened into a low murmur as more people began watching. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of St. Mark's Church and stretched across the long tables where plates of roasted chicken and green beans were slowly being forgotten. Mrs. Turner leaned down slightly so that she could see Emily's face more clearly. "Emily, can you hear me?" she asked in a calm voice that carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent many years caring for others. Emily nodded faintly but did not lift her head. Across the table, Linda Carter exhaled sharply, as if the entire moment had already become an inconvenience. She pushed her chair back a few inches and crossed her arms again. "This is exactly what I mean," Linda said to no one in particular, though everyone nearby could hear her. "She does this every time something is not about her." A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. David Carter shifted in his seat, his hand resting on the back of his chair as he looked between his mother and his wife. The expression on his face was uncertain, almost conflicted, as if he was trying to decide which voice in the room to believe. For most of his life, David had known his mother as a calm and practical woman who rarely complained about anything. She had spent 35 years teaching literature at Columbus Central High School, guiding thousands of students through novels, essays, and the careful discipline of language. Even after retirement, many of those former students still stopped her in grocery stores to thank her for helping them believe they could succeed. Yet over the past few years, something had quietly changed within the family. After Robert Carter passed away, Emily had begun living alone in the small two-story house she and Robert had purchased decades earlier. The house stood just 15 minutes away from David and Linda's modern brick home on the other side of Columbus. At first, Emily visited them every Sunday, bringing homemade peach cobbler or apple pie the way she had done since David was a child. But Linda often smiled politely while gently steering conversations in another direction whenever Emily mentioned feeling tired or unwell. "You worry too much," Linda would say with a small laugh. "You are healthy. You just need to stay busy." Over time, the phrase became more familiar. Whenever Emily mentioned the tight feeling that sometimes appeared in her chest or the occasional wave of dizziness that made her sit down for a moment, Linda would shake her head and repeat the same explanation. "You are imagining things again." Now, inside the bright fellowship hall, those past moments seemed to gather quietly beneath the surface of the present one. Mrs. Turner remained beside Emily and slowly turned toward the others seated nearby. "Someone should call an ambulance," she said gently but firmly. Linda immediately shook her head. "That is not necessary," she replied quickly. "She will be perfectly fine in 5 minutes. She always is." Several people looked uncertain, but Mrs. Turner did not move away. She studied Emily's face again and noticed the faint sheen of sweat across the older woman's forehead. "Emily," she said softly, "I think we should have someone check on you." For a long moment, Emily remained silent. Then she lifted her eyes slightly, not toward Linda or David, but toward the small group of concerned faces gathering around the table. In that quiet instant, 25 people were watching closely, and none of them yet realized that the truth behind this moment had been building quietly for many months. Emily Carter finally lifted her head a little higher, though the movement was slow and careful, as if even the smallest motion required effort. The fellowship hall had grown unusually quiet. Conversations had faded, and the soft clatter of plates had stopped almost completely. 25 people were now watching the same moment unfold beneath the bright church lights. Mrs. Turner remained beside Emily, her posture calm but alert, the kind of quiet readiness that came from years of experience noticing when something was not right. She gently placed one hand on the table so that Emily could steady herself if needed. "Emily, I am going to ask you something simple," Mrs. Turner said in a reassuring voice. "Are you feeling pressure in your chest right now?" Emily hesitated before giving a small nod. Her voice, when it finally came, was soft but clear. "Yes. It started again a few minutes ago." The words drifted across the table, and several people exchanged worried looks. Mrs. Turner inhaled slowly. "Then we should not wait," she said. "Someone please call emergency services." Before anyone else could react, Linda Carter spoke again, her voice sharper now, carrying across the room with unmistakable irritation. "This is completely unnecessary," she said. "She has been doing this for months." The sentence hung in the air, drawing the attention of people at nearby tables who had not been paying close attention earlier. David Carter looked at his wife with a puzzled expression. "What do you mean months?" he asked quietly. Linda shrugged, as if the explanation were obvious. "Every time she feels like people are ignoring her, she says she is not well. Last spring she claimed she was dizzy in the grocery store. 2 weeks later she said the same thing during dinner. Nothing ever happens. She just wants everyone to stop what they are doing." A faint murmur moved through the room. Emily did not respond to the accusation. Instead, she kept her gaze lowered toward the tablecloth, breathing slowly while the edges of the room seemed to blur slightly around her. Mrs. Turner studied her face carefully again. The retired nurse had spent decades observing subtle signs that others often overlooked, and something about Emily's quiet stillness made her uneasy. "Emily," she asked gently, "have you spoken to a doctor about these symptoms before?" For the first time since the room had gone silent, Emily looked uncertain. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. "I tried," she said after a moment. "Several times." Mrs. Turner leaned closer. "What happened?" Emily hesitated again, glancing briefly toward David before lowering her eyes once more. Her answer came slowly, as if she had grown used to keeping certain thoughts to herself. "The appointments were canceled." Linda immediately laughed, though the sound did not carry the easy humor she intended. "That is not true," she said quickly. "She forgets things all the time. She probably mixed up the dates." But Mrs. Turner did not look away from Emily. "Emily," she said softly, "did you cancel them yourself?" Emily shook her head. A faint tremor passed through her hands. "No," she said quietly. "I did not." The words were simple, yet they shifted something inside the room. Several people who had been sitting quietly began exchanging looks of growing concern. David frowned slightly, as if a small piece of a larger puzzle had suddenly appeared in front of him. "What do you mean the appointments were canceled?" he asked his mother. Emily took another careful breath. Her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet weight behind it now. "Every time I scheduled a visit with the clinic," she said slowly, "someone called later and said the appointment had already been canceled." She paused, and her eyes moved briefly across the faces gathered around the table. 25 people were listening now, and the truth that had been quietly building for months had finally begun to surface. For a few seconds no one spoke. The quiet in the fellowship hall felt heavier now, as if the room itself had begun listening more carefully. David Carter looked from his mother to his wife with a growing crease between his eyebrows. The words Emily had just spoken did not match the picture he had been hearing for months. "Canceled," he repeated slowly. "Who canceled them?" Emily did not answer right away. Her eyes remained on the tablecloth where a small spill of iced tea had begun soaking into the fabric. The cold glass that had slipped earlier still rested on its side near her elbow, forgotten by everyone except Mrs. Turner, who quietly moved it aside so Emily would not knock it again. Emily inhaled carefully before speaking. "The clinic always told me someone had already called," she said. "They said the person confirmed my information and canceled the visit." A few people nearby shifted in their seats. The explanation was simple, but it raised more questions than it answered. Mrs. Turner straightened slightly and looked toward David. "Did you know about this?" she asked in a calm but direct voice. David blinked, clearly surprised. "No," he said quickly. "Mom never told me." Emily looked up then, meeting her son's eyes for the first time since she had sat down. Her expression was not angry. It was quiet, almost tired. "I did tell you," she said gently. "Twice." David's confusion deepened. "When?" Emily spoke slowly, as though she were remembering the details step by step. "Once in April when I called you after the grocery store. I told you I felt lightheaded and that the clinic appointment I scheduled had disappeared from their calendar." She paused briefly before continuing. "The second time was 3 weeks ago during dinner at your house." Several people at the table turned toward David, waiting for his reaction. David opened his mouth, but hesitated. The memory seemed to surface slowly, like something buried under other conversations. "You said you might have written the wrong date down," he replied uncertainly. Before Emily could answer, Linda spoke again, her voice rising slightly as if she wanted to push the moment away before it grew larger. "Exactly," she said. "That is what happened. She mixes things up sometimes. Everyone knows that." But Mrs. Turner did not look convinced. She folded her arms thoughtfully and studied Linda for a moment before returning her attention to Emily. "Emily," she asked, Did the clinic say who called to cancel? Emily nodded faintly. They told me the caller confirmed my name, my birth date, and my insurance information. The room grew even quieter. Several people exchanged uneasy glances again. Those were details that strangers would not easily know. David slowly turned his head toward Linda. Did you ever call the clinic for Mom? He asked. Linda laughed again, though the sound carried a sharp edge now. Why would I do that? She replied. I have my own schedule to manage. David continued watching her, and for the first time his expression showed a trace of doubt. Across the room, someone quietly pulled out a phone, already preparing to call for help despite the earlier disagreement. Meanwhile, Emily sat quietly, her breathing still careful but slightly steadier than before. She did not accuse anyone. She did not raise her voice. She simply remained seated at the long table beneath the church lights while 25 people listened to the pieces of a story that had been quietly unfolding for months, and many of them were beginning to realize that the truth behind those canceled appointments might be far more serious than anyone had assumed. David Carter remained silent for several seconds, and the hesitation in his expression did not go unnoticed by the people seated around the table. The warm Sunday atmosphere that usually filled the fellowship hall had faded completely now, replaced by a careful stillness, as if everyone present understood that something important was unfolding in front of them. Mrs. Turner glanced toward the young man who had quietly stepped aside with his phone earlier. Within moments he returned and spoke softly to her. Emergency services are on the way, he said. Mrs. Turner nodded with quiet approval and then turned her attention back to Emily Carter, whose breathing had become slightly steadier but still carried the controlled rhythm of someone concentrating on every inhale. Emily did not seem surprised by any of the conversation that had followed her explanation. She sat calmly, her posture slightly leaned forward, hands resting lightly on the table as though conserving her strength. Across from her, Linda Carter shifted in her chair again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. This is getting out of hand, Linda said with forced lightness. All of you are treating this like some kind of emergency, when it is clearly not. A few people at the far end of the table exchanged looks, but no one responded immediately. David leaned back slowly in his chair and looked toward his mother again. The memory of that dinner 3 weeks earlier was becoming clearer in his mind now. He remembered Emily mentioning the clinic appointment, and he remembered Linda responding quickly, explaining that his mother had probably misunderstood the scheduling message. At the time he had accepted the explanation without question. Now, sitting in the quiet church hall with 25 people listening closely, that certainty felt less solid than it had before. Mom, David said carefully, did the clinic ever tell you what number called to cancel the appointment? Emily shook her head slowly. They said the caller used the main contact number listed on my file, she replied. David frowned slightly. That number would be. His sentence faded before he finished it, because both he and Linda knew the answer. The contact number listed on Emily's medical file had been updated 2 years earlier when Linda offered to help organize some paperwork after Robert Carter passed away. Linda had explained at the time that she was simply helping keep track of family information in case of emergencies. David's gaze shifted toward his wife. Linda, he said quietly, that number is our home phone. Linda's smile tightened for a brief moment before she responded. Yes. But that does not mean I called the clinic, she said quickly. Anyone could have used the number. The explanation hung awkwardly in the air. Mrs. Turner did not interrupt, but her calm expression made it clear that she was carefully observing every word. Emily remained silent again, though her eyes briefly moved across the faces gathered around the table. Many of those people had known her for decades. They had attended school events where she helped students perform Shakespeare plays. They had watched her volunteer at community book drives. None of them had ever seen her behave dramatically. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice soft but steady. The clinic receptionist told me something else that day, she said. She said the person who canceled the appointment sounded very certain that I did not need to be seen. A quiet ripple of discomfort passed through the group. David slowly lowered his eyes toward the table, thinking through the months that had passed since the first time his mother mentioned feeling unwell. The pattern that had once seemed ordinary was beginning to look very different now, and the truth that had started to surface in the church hall was becoming harder for anyone in that room to ignore. David Carter remained very still after hearing his mother's last sentence, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had been said so far. The fellowship hall was no longer a place for casual conversation or Sunday laughter. Plates sat half-finished on the long tables, while 25 people watched a quiet truth continue to unfold. Outside the tall windows, the afternoon sun rested over the parking lot of St. Mark's Church, but inside the room the atmosphere felt strangely cold. Linda Carter shifted again in her chair and forced another smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "This is all speculation," she said, her tone sharper now. "Receptionists make mistakes all the time. People misunderstand things." Emily probably heard what she wanted to hear. No one immediately agreed with her. Mrs. Turner remained beside Emily with the same calm presence she had held since the moment Emily sat down. The retired nurse could hear the steady but strained rhythm in Emily's breathing, and she gently placed a reassuring hand near the older woman's shoulder without interrupting the conversation. Across the table, David slowly rubbed his forehead, the way people sometimes do when a memory begins rearranging itself in their mind. Over the past year, he had trusted Linda to manage many small details in their family life. She handled schedules, insurance forms, and the occasional appointment when Emily needed help organizing paperwork. At the time, it had seemed practical. Now, sitting in the quiet church hall, David began recalling small moments he had never questioned before. There was the afternoon in early May when Emily had mentioned feeling weak after walking from the grocery store to her car. David remembered suggesting she visit the clinic. Linda had answered before Emily could respond. She had said the appointment had already been canceled because Emily was feeling better. At the time, he had accepted that explanation without a second thought. But now the memory felt different. "Linda," David said slowly, "did you ever call the clinic for Mom?" Linda let out a short laugh again, though it sounded thinner than before. "I already told you I did not," she replied quickly. "You are acting like this is some kind of investigation." David did not answer right away. His gaze shifted toward his mother again. Emily Carter sat quietly, her shoulders relaxed in a way that suggested long practice with patience. She had spent decades guiding teenagers through literature and debate, and she had learned long ago that truth often revealed itself without force. She simply waited. A faint sound from outside interrupted the tension for a moment. In the distance, the quiet hum of an approaching ambulance could be heard moving through the nearby streets of Columbus. Several people near the windows glanced outside. Mrs. Turner nodded slightly, relieved that help was arriving. David noticed the sound as well, and the realization seemed to settle more heavily over him. If Emily truly had been feeling these symptoms for months, then every canceled appointment mattered more than he had ever realized. He looked again toward Linda, this time with a deeper seriousness in his expression. "Mom has never asked for attention like that," he said quietly. "You know that." Linda opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed slower now, as if the room itself had begun weighing every explanation. Meanwhile, Emily finally lifted her eyes again and looked across the table at her son. Her voice, when she spoke, remained calm and gentle. "David," she said, "I did not want to cause problems. I only wanted to understand why every time I tried to see a doctor, someone decided that I did not need to go." And as the distant sound of the ambulance grew louder, outside the church building, the question hung quietly in the air where 25 people were now waiting to hear the answer. The distant sound of the ambulance grew clearer as it turned onto the quiet street outside St. Mark's Church, and several people near the windows shifted in their seats as they listened. Inside the fellowship hall, however, no one spoke. The question Emily Carter had just asked remained suspended in the air, simple but heavy with meaning. David Carter slowly leaned forward, resting his hands on the edge of the table as if he needed something solid beneath them. His mind was moving through the past months with new attention now, revisiting conversations that once seemed unimportant. He remembered the afternoon in early June when Emily called and said she felt unusually tired after walking through her garden. He had suggested she see a doctor then as well. Linda had been sitting beside him at the kitchen counter that evening, and she had reached over to squeeze his hand while smiling calmly. She had said Emily only needed more rest. At the time, David had believed her without hesitation. Now the memory felt different, as if a quiet detail had been hidden inside it all along. Across the table, Linda Carter shifted again and let out a small breath that sounded more impatient than before. "I cannot believe we are still talking about this," she said. The ambulance will arrive, they will check her, and everything will be fine, just like always. Mrs. Turner did not respond to Linda. Instead, she glanced toward the door as the sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder. Emily remained seated, her posture still and composed, though her hands rested lightly together now, as if conserving her energy. The room smelled faintly of coffee and warm bread, remnants of the meal that had been interrupted by the unfolding conversation. David slowly turned his head toward Linda again. His voice was quieter this time, but far more serious. "Linda," he said, "the clinic receptionist would not cancel appointments unless someone confirmed the patient information. That means whoever called knew Mom's birth date and insurance details." Linda's expression tightened again for a moment before she forced another smile. "Those things are not secrets," she replied quickly. "Anyone in the family could know them." David nodded slowly, though the movement carried more doubt than agreement. "Yes," he said, "anyone in the family." The words settled across the table in a way that made several people glance between the two of them. At that moment, the church doors opened and two paramedics stepped quietly into the hall carrying a small medical bag. Their arrival shifted the room slightly, bringing a calm professional energy into the tense atmosphere. Mrs. Turner immediately stood and greeted them with a short explanation of what had happened. The paramedics approached Emily carefully, speaking in calm voices while one of them checked her pulse and asked a few gentle questions about how she felt. Emily answered simply and honestly, never exaggerating her symptoms. David watched the scene with growing concern, noticing details he had overlooked before. His mother's face looked paler than usual beneath the bright church lights, and the careful rhythm of her breathing suggested she had been managing this discomfort quietly for longer than anyone realized. Meanwhile, Linda remained seated, her arms folded as she observed the paramedics with a tight expression. "You see," she said quietly to no one in particular, "this will all turn out to be nothing." But as the paramedic finished checking Emily's pulse, he looked toward Mrs. Turner and then toward David with a thoughtful seriousness. "We are going to take her to the hospital for a proper evaluation," he said calmly. "Symptoms like this should never be ignored." The sentence echoed softly through the quiet room, and for the first time that afternoon David Carter felt a deep unease settle in his chest. Because if Emily had been trying to see a doctor for months, then the truth behind those canceled appointments was no longer a small misunderstanding. It was something far more troubling than anyone in that church hall had imagined. The paramedic's calm voice remained steady as he finished speaking, but the meaning of his words settled deeply across the quiet fellowship hall. 25 people had now heard the same conclusion. Emily Carter needed to be taken to the hospital. The statement carried a quiet weight that none of the earlier dismissals could erase. David Carter stood slowly from his chair, the legs scraping softly against the wooden floor. For a moment he looked uncertain, as if he had just stepped into a situation he no longer fully understood. He moved closer to his mother while the paramedics gently prepared a small portable monitor from their bag. Emily watched them with calm patience, answering their questions in clear, measured sentences. "How long have you been feeling this pressure?" one of the paramedics asked kindly. Emily thought for a moment before replying. "It has come and gone for several months," she said. "Sometimes it passes quickly. Other times it stays longer." The paramedic nodded thoughtfully while writing notes on a small tablet. Mrs. Turner remained nearby, her presence quiet but reassuring. David listened carefully to his mother's answer, and something about the length of time she described made his chest tighten slightly. Months. The word repeated itself in his mind while he remembered all the conversations he had dismissed too quickly. Meanwhile, Linda Carter remained seated at the table with her arms folded, her posture stiff with growing frustration. She watched the paramedics moving calmly around Emily as though the entire scene had become unnecessarily dramatic. "This is exactly what I said would happen," Linda muttered under her breath. "They are overreacting." A few people nearby glanced toward her, but no one responded. The atmosphere in the room had shifted in a way that made her earlier confidence sound out of place. The paramedic who had been checking Emily's pulse looked up again and spoke gently. "We would like to transport you to Riverside Methodist Hospital so a doctor can evaluate your symptoms properly," he explained. "It is always better to be cautious with chest discomfort." Emily gave a small nod of understanding. She had spent most of her life encouraging young students to listen carefully before making decisions, and she applied that same calm reasoning to herself now. David stepped closer to her chair. "Mom, I will ride with you," he said quietly. Emily looked up at him with a soft expression that carried neither blame nor accusation. "You do not need to worry," she replied gently. "They will take good care of me." David shook his head slightly. "I know," he said, "but I want to be there." As the paramedics carefully helped Emily stand, the room seemed to exhale a quiet breath that no one had realized they were holding. Several people stepped aside respectfully while the medical team guided Emily toward the church entrance. The sunlight outside spilled through the open doors, illuminating the hallway beyond. Before leaving the room, Emily paused briefly and glanced back at the long table where the interrupted luncheon still waited. 25 people were watching silently now, their earlier uncertainty replaced by thoughtful concern. Linda remained seated, her expression tight as she observed the scene unfold. David noticed that many of the same faces who had listened to Linda earlier were now watching her differently. It was not accusation, but something closer to quiet doubt. As Emily walked slowly toward the waiting ambulance with the paramedics beside her, David followed a few steps behind. And in that quiet moment, the simple truth that had begun surfacing inside the fellowship hall continued to grow clearer in his mind. If his mother had been trying to see a doctor for months, then someone had made sure those visits never happened, and sooner or later he was going to learn exactly why. The ambulance doors closed gently behind Emily Carter as the paramedics helped her settle onto the seat inside the vehicle. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the church parking lot, and the quiet hum of the engine filled the brief silence before the vehicle began moving. David Carter sat across from his mother inside the ambulance, his hands resting on his knees while he watched the paramedic attach a small monitor to Emily's finger. The device beeped softly, its steady rhythm echoing in the small space. Emily remained calm, her breathing slow and measured, the same steady patience she had shown throughout the afternoon. Outside the window, the familiar streets of Columbus passed by slowly, ordinary neighborhoods and small storefronts that David had driven past hundreds of times. Yet everything felt different now. The conversation from the fellowship hall continued replaying in his mind. Months. The word returned again and again as he remembered each small moment his mother had tried to explain something that he had brushed aside. One of the paramedics glanced at the monitor and nodded slightly. "Your pulse is steady," he said in a reassuring tone. "We just want to let the doctors run a few tests to make sure everything is all right." Emily nodded politely. "Thank you," she replied softly. David watched her carefully, noticing the faint lines of exhaustion beneath her eyes that he had not recognized before. She had always carried herself with quiet strength, even after his father passed away 3 years earlier. Robert Carter had been the steady center of their family, a thoughtful man who believed in solving problems patiently. David suddenly wondered what his father would have said about everything that had happened over the past few months. Meanwhile, back at St. Mark's Church, the fellowship hall remained unusually quiet long after the ambulance had left. Several people stood near the windows watching the vehicle disappear down the street. The unfinished meal sat untouched on the long tables, forgotten as the earlier conversation continued lingering in everyone's thoughts. Linda Carter finally stood from her chair and gathered her purse with a quick movement. Her expression carried a tight irritation that she tried to hide behind a polite smile. "Well," she said lightly, "this afternoon certainly became more dramatic than expected." No one laughed. Mrs. Turner remained standing near the table where Emily had been sitting earlier. Her calm expression had not changed, but her eyes followed Linda with thoughtful attention. Several of the church members exchanged quiet looks with one another, the same realization passing silently between them. Earlier they had heard Linda dismiss Emily's symptoms as attention-seeking. Now they had also heard Emily describe months of canceled medical appointments. The contrast between those two explanations had become impossible to ignore. Linda walked toward the exit with quick, purposeful steps. But as she reached the doorway, she noticed the same 25 people who had witnessed the entire conversation still standing in small groups around the room. Their expressions were not angry. They were something quieter and more serious than that. Doubt had replaced the easy confidence Linda had carried earlier. Mrs. Turner gently folded the tablecloth where Emily's glass had spilled and placed the cloth aside for cleaning. She then looked toward the other church members with a calm voice. "Emily has always been one of the most patient people in this community," she said quietly. She would not invent something like this. Her words were not loud, but they carried through the still room. Outside, the afternoon light continued fading slowly as the day moved toward evening. And although the church hall gradually returned to its normal quiet routine, every person who had been present understood the same thing. The truth about those canceled appointments had only just begun to surface, and sooner or later the full explanation would come to light. The ambulance arrived at Riverside Methodist Hospital just as the sky above Columbus began turning a soft shade of early evening blue. The vehicle slowed beneath the bright lights of the emergency entrance, and the paramedics carefully opened the rear doors. David Carter stepped out first, glancing around the busy hospital driveway where nurses and medical staff moved calmly between arriving patients and waiting vehicles. Inside the ambulance, Emily Carter remained seated, still composed despite the long afternoon that had already passed. One of the paramedics spoke gently while helping her step down. "We're going to bring you inside for a few tests," he said. "The doctors will want to check your heart and make sure everything looks normal." Emily nodded quietly. She had spent many years teaching her students that patience and listening were often the best first steps toward understanding any problem, and she approached the situation the same way now. David walked beside her as they entered the emergency department, the automatic doors sliding open with a quiet mechanical sound. Inside the hospital lobby, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm coffee from a nearby vending station. Nurses greeted the paramedics and guided Emily toward a small examination room where a doctor would soon see her. David remained close, watching as the medical staff worked efficiently around his mother. For the first time that day, he noticed how tired she looked beneath the bright hospital lights. Not dramatic, not exaggerating, simply tired in a way that suggested she had been carrying something alone for a long time. A nurse placed a blood pressure cuff around Emily's arm and began asking gentle questions about her symptoms. "When did the pressure start today?" she asked. Emily answered clearly. "Earlier this afternoon while I was standing in the church hall." The nurse nodded and continued writing notes. "Have you experienced this before?" Emily hesitated briefly before replying. "Yes, several times during the past few months." David listened carefully to every word. Each answer confirmed what he had begun realizing in the ambulance. His mother had been trying to say something for months, and he had not truly heard her. Meanwhile, across town, Linda Carter had just arrived back at their house. She placed her purse on the kitchen counter and walked slowly through the quiet living room. The house felt unusually still without David there. For a moment, she turned on the television, as if hoping the familiar noise would push the afternoon out of her mind. But the conversation from the church hall continued repeating itself in her thoughts. The canceled appointments, the clinic phone call, the questions David had begun asking. Linda walked toward the window and looked out across the quiet neighborhood street. She told herself that everything would settle once the hospital confirmed there was nothing serious. That was what had always happened before. Yet somewhere in the back of her mind a small uneasiness had begun forming. Back at the hospital, a doctor finally entered the examination room where Emily and David were waiting. He introduced himself calmly and began reviewing the notes from the paramedics. After listening carefully to Emily describe her symptoms, he nodded with thoughtful attention. "You did the right thing coming here today," the doctor said in a reassuring voice. "Chest pressure that continues over several months should always be evaluated." David slowly lowered his eyes toward the floor as those words settled over him. Because if his mother truly had been trying to see a doctor for months, then the story behind those canceled appointments was no longer just a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of a truth that was about to become impossible for anyone in their family to ignore. The doctor pulled a small stool closer to Emily Carter's hospital bed and sat down with the calm patience of someone who had spent many years listening carefully before speaking. The soft hum of medical equipment filled the quiet examination room, while a heart monitor traced a steady rhythm on the screen beside her. David Carter stood near the wall with his arms loosely folded, watching every movement as the doctor reviewed the notes from the paramedics and the nurse. Outside the room, the hallway carried the distant sounds of hospital life, rolling carts, quiet conversations, and the occasional chime of elevator doors opening and closing. Yet inside the small room, everything felt focused on the conversation that was about to happen. The doctor looked up from the chart and met Emily's eyes with a reassuring expression. "Mrs. Carter, we are going to run several tests this evening," he said in a steady voice. Your symptoms could have a number of explanations, but the important thing is that you came in so we can evaluate them properly. Emily nodded politely. She had always believed in listening carefully before worrying, and that calm habit remained with her now. David stepped a little closer to the bed. Doctor, he said quietly, my mother mentioned she has been experiencing this for months. The doctor turned his attention toward him with thoughtful interest. That is important information, he replied. Did she receive medical evaluation when the symptoms first started? David hesitated. The silence that followed was not long, but it carried a weight that made the question feel heavier than it sounded. Finally, he shook his head slowly. No, he said. Every appointment she tried to schedule was canceled. The doctor raised his eyebrows slightly, not in accusation but in careful consideration. Canceled by the clinic? He asked. Emily spoke gently from the bed. They told me someone called and canceled the appointments after I scheduled them. The doctor leaned back slightly on the stool while absorbing that explanation. He had practiced medicine long enough to know that missed appointments sometimes hid complicated family situations that patients did not always explain easily. He nodded once and spoke calmly. We will focus on your health first, he said. Everything else can be sorted out later. A nurse entered the room carrying a small tray with additional monitoring equipment. She placed the tray beside the bed and began preparing the materials needed for the tests. David stepped back slightly to give her space while his thoughts continued circling the same unsettling realization. Months. The same word kept returning in his mind like a quiet echo. Across town in the quiet Carter home, Linda Carter sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. The television in the living room continued playing softly in the background, but she had stopped paying attention to it. The house felt strangely empty without David there. She tapped her fingers against the table and glanced at the clock above the refrigerator. The hospital visit should have been routine. That was what she had been telling herself since leaving the church earlier. Yet something about the way people had looked at her in the fellowship hall refused to leave her thoughts. Back in the hospital room, the nurse finished attaching the monitoring leads and stepped aside so the doctor could review the readings. The doctor studied the screen carefully before speaking again. Mrs. Carter, the test will give us a clearer picture of what has been happening, he said. But based on what you described, it is very possible that these symptoms should have been evaluated sooner. David lowered his gaze toward the floor as the meaning of those words settled quietly over him. Because if his mother had truly been trying to see a doctor for months, then the truth behind those canceled appointments was no longer just a question waiting for answers. It had already begun revealing something about the past that he had failed to notice until now. The examination room remained quiet after the doctor finished speaking, and the soft rhythm of the heart monitor continued tracing steady lines across the screen beside Emily Carter's bed. The nurse adjusted a small sensor on Emily's finger while the doctor reviewed the first set of readings. David Carter stood near the window with his hands resting against the cool surface of the wall, his thoughts moving slowly through everything he had heard during the past few hours. The afternoon had begun as a simple church luncheon, something that had happened countless Sundays before. Now it had turned into a moment that was quietly reshaping the way he understood the past several months of his mother's life. Emily watched the doctor with calm attention. She had always believed that listening carefully was the first step towards solving any problem, and that belief had guided her through decades of teaching young students who needed patience more than judgment. Doctor, she said gently, I did not want to cause trouble for anyone. I only wanted to understand why I kept feeling this pressure. The doctor gave a small, reassuring nod. You are not causing trouble, he replied. You are doing exactly what a patient should do when something feels wrong. He turned slightly toward the monitor again and reviewed the numbers displayed on the screen. Your heart rhythm is stable right now, but the symptoms you described suggest that something may have been developing gradually. David felt the words settle heavily in his chest. Developing gradually. That meant the signs had likely been present for some time. His mind returned once again to the same memory. His mother mentioning dizziness, fatigue, and the strange pressure in her chest. Each time he had accepted the explanation that it was nothing serious. Each time he had trusted Linda's quick reassurances. Across town, Linda Carter still sat alone at the kitchen table in the quiet Carter house. The evening light outside had faded, and the kitchen was illuminated only by the soft glow of the overhead lamp. She picked up her phone again and scrolled through her messages, expecting to see a call or update from David. None had arrived yet. The silence made the house feel larger and emptier than usual. She told herself again that the hospital would run routine tests and send Emily home by morning. That was what she continued repeating in her mind. Yet the memory of the church hall remained vivid. 25 people listening as Emily calmly explained the canceled appointments. Back in the hospital room, the nurse finished preparing the equipment for the next test and stepped aside. The doctor turned his attention fully toward Emily and David. "We are going to perform a few additional evaluations tonight," he explained. "They will help us understand whether the symptoms you described have a cardiovascular cause." Emily nodded once more with quiet understanding. David slowly exhaled as he looked at his mother again. For the first time that evening, he spoke with a softer voice than before. "Mom," he said, "I should have listened more carefully." Emily met his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the day. "Sometimes people hear things when they are ready," she replied gently. The doctor observed the exchange silently for a moment before standing and placing the chart back on the small counter. "The important thing now is that we have the opportunity to evaluate your health properly," he said. "Once we understand what is happening medically, the rest of the questions can be addressed." David nodded slowly, because deep down he already understood what those other questions would lead to. The truth about the canceled appointments was no longer hidden behind misunderstandings or quick explanations. It had begun surfacing piece by piece in front of witnesses at the church, and now it stood quietly in the hospital room, waiting to be fully uncovered. The hospital room grew quieter as evening settled fully outside the windows of Riverside Methodist Hospital. The soft lights above Emily Carter's bed cast a gentle glow across the small space, while the steady rhythm of the heart monitor continued its calm, reassuring pattern. David Carter remained standing near the foot of the bed, watching the nurse carefully prepare the next set of tests the doctor had ordered. For a long moment, neither he nor his mother spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it carried the quiet weight of thoughts that were still forming. Emily rested her hands lightly on the blanket while she looked toward the window. The distant lights of Columbus shimmered faintly beyond the glass, and she seemed to study them, as if gathering her strength from the calm of the evening. After a few moments, she turned her head back toward David. "You should not blame yourself," she said gently. "Families trust each other. That is how families are supposed to work." David nodded slowly, though the reassurance did not fully ease the tension in his chest. He had spent the past hour replaying conversation after conversation in his mind. Each memory now carried small details he had once ignored. Linda answering quickly when Emily spoke. Linda insisting that the clinic had made a scheduling mistake. Linda offering to manage the contact information on Emily's medical records after Robert Carter passed away. At the time, those actions had seemed helpful, even thoughtful. Now they looked very different when placed beside the story Emily had told earlier that afternoon in front of 25 witnesses at St. Mark's Church. The nurse finished attaching another monitor and checked the readings carefully before leaving the room to deliver the information to the doctor. As the door closed softly behind her, David walked closer to the bed and sat down in the chair beside his mother. "Mom," he said quietly, "when did the first appointment get canceled?" Emily thought for a moment before answering. "Late February," she said. "I scheduled a visit after I felt dizzy while watering the garden." David nodded slowly. "February had been almost 8 months ago. Did you tell Linda about that appointment?" he asked carefully. Emily looked down at her hands for a moment before replying. "She asked about it," she said. "I mentioned the clinic visit when we were having dinner at your house that week." David leaned back slightly in the chair, absorbing the timeline as it formed in his mind. February, April, then the conversation 3 weeks earlier. The pattern now looked far too consistent to be explained by simple confusion. Meanwhile, across town, Linda Carter stood near the kitchen sink, staring out the window into the quiet neighborhood street. The sky had turned dark, and the porch lights of nearby houses glowed softly in the evening air. She had tried watching television again, but the voices on the screen had begun to irritate her. Instead, she had turned it off and let the silence return. Her phone remained on the kitchen counter, but she had not received a message from David yet. That absence felt longer than it should have. Back in the hospital room, the door opened again, and the doctor returned holding the first test results. He stepped beside the bed and looked at Emily with calm professionalism. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, The early readings suggest that your symptoms were not imagined or exaggerated. Your heart has been under strain for some time. The words settled slowly in the quiet room. David lowered his gaze toward the floor as the truth continued revealing itself piece by piece. Because if his mother's symptoms had truly been developing for months, then the canceled appointments were no longer just unfortunate timing. They were the missing steps in a story that was only now beginning to show its full meaning. Tioi with grave in bnoi dung chuin thun, a with circumflexem ton ton, bnoi dung chuin thun, a with circumflexem ton.